This year's COP29 was just the latest example of Indigenous activists being sidelined in international forums, leading many to question how Indigenous peoples can affect the future of climate action and organize to combat the climate crisis. Joining us to discuss this is Lakota activist Nick Estes, co-founder of the podcast and advocacy group, The Red Nation. Nick, so good to see you. Welcome to Upfront. You've argued that people often reduce the vast history of Indigenous resistance in the United States to just being about anti-pipeline protests. But there's been a long history of Indigenous resistance rooted in a demand for recognizing the sovereignty of Native American nations, also returning Indigenous homelands, and of course, combating colonialism. What does Indigenous activism and resistance look like today, particularly in response to the climate crisis?
Thanks for having me, Mark. That's a really great question. There's an assumption that Indigenous nations didn't have laws, didn't have customs, didn't have governance prior to the arrival of Europeans. So much of what we see as Indigenous resistance or Indigenous activism is simply upholding what came before the United States or came before settler colonial nations. So, for example, we see the anti-pipeline struggle or the struggles against fossil fuels in North America as halting or challenging at least a quarter of carbon emissions from both Canada and the United States. So when we talk about Indigenous resistance today, I don't want to romanticize Indigenous nations. We shouldn't think of Indigenous peoples as sort of belonging to this kind of untouched past where they were one with nature, because today many Indigenous nations within the United States, the Navajo Nation, for example, which is heavily invested in the oil and gas industry, as well as being, invested in sort of green technologies. So to talk about sovereignty, there's multiple registers. It's not just this sort of idealistic sort of, yeah, we're going to go back one with nature. So when we talk about Indigenous resistance in this context, there's the global movement of Indigenous peoples. If you look at the history at the United Nations, which really began in the 1970s, the recognition of Indigenous peoples is relatively recent in terms of the international forums. So when we look at something like COP29, we can see sort of a general recalcitrance to include Indigenous voices or non-state, minority groups.
I was going to say there is a reluctance to include certain groups. I mean, the fossil fuel lobby, for example, was represented by 10 times the number of attendees as Indigenous participants. When you think about transitions out of, say, a carbon economy to a green economy, you stated before that populations that have historically been colonized are going to bear the burden of this transition. Talk to me about what that means. Are there specific examples of Indigenous communities that are going to have to really bear the cost of that kind of what seems to be necessary shift ultimately?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it goes without saying it's a necessary shift. But, according to the World Bank, it's going to require about 3 billion tons of metals and minerals such as copper and lithium to make that transition by 2025, by 2050. So it's going to require mining fresh copper. That doesn't include things like nickel, cobalt, all these things that go into something like a Tesla battery or the lithium that goes into that. There's a reason why Elon Musk is building his factories in places like the Nevada desert, because they're trying to mine lithium. They're trying to use these areas as new frontiers for exploitation. And we see this, with the lithium economy, extractive economy that's, budding within the Andean region that's targeting Indigenous communities there. And we're now seeing it here in the United States at places like Thacker Pass, where they want to build a massive, open pit lithium mine.
There's a more fundamental issue here that you've alluded to today, and I've heard you, when we've been places, speak to very explicitly and articulately, and that is the question of settler colonialism. If the settler comes to colonize, or they say that, the colonizer comes to stay and to extract and to exploit, if they're trying to take over the land, then it's in their best interest to protect the land. It's in their best interest to protect the environment because they're living there now. So why do we see in the context of North America such vicious assaults on the environment? Why do we see for example, a commitment to a carbon economy if ultimately it's going to spell the demise even for the settler?
Mhm. Well, that's a really complicated question. I think the first part of it is that most of the risks of climate catastrophe have been sort of outsourced to the rest of the world and outsourced to indigenous peoples internally within the settler colony itself. You have things like, Fortress America, you have the hardening of borders, you have the hardening of, immigration. That's all in response to climate change, which is directly, in relationship to U.S. imperialist interventions in these countries that is causing these massive migration shifts, whether it's through sanctions or direct warfare itself. So when we think about like, well, doesn't, we all drink from the same common pot, like why would it make sense for settlers to basically spoil the well that we all drink from? I think right now we're actually experiencing that. We've seen neoliberalism be completely exhausted. We've seen neoconservatism be completely exhausted as political alternatives, and thus we get the rise of somebody like Trump, who is offering some kind of alternative, which really isn't much of a deviation from the status quo. And we're seeing places like East Palestine, where there's that major environmental disaster affecting poor white people who are descendants of these settlers. And so really what we're gonna see in this moment in time, especially in the context of these, the so-called imperial core or within the settler colony itself, is the exacerbation of class differences.
Let me ask you a question on a slightly different note connected to what you're saying.
Sure.
When you look back over the last 4 years, do you feel like there was progress in moving from Trump to Biden?
Biden said before he was elected president that nothing fundamentally would change. So in many ways, I don't really see a fundamental shift. I mean, you just see a shift in rhetoric. You have somebody who's more explicit about what they're going to do and how they feel about, especially racialized or indigenous people. And then you have somebody who says, "I'm going to do a land acknowledgement while I grant more oil and gas drilling permits than the previous administration." That's Biden's, oil. That was Biden's energy policy. He granted more oil and gas permits on public lands than Trump did within his first 2 years of his presidency. So these promises made about being, the first climate president don't, you can listen to a person's words, but you should judge them by their actions. And we can talk about the context of Minnesota. It's a perfect example in how you have a governor who gives lip service to indigenous sovereignty, and you have a lieutenant governor who is an indigenous woman herself oversee the construction of a pipeline that's transporting tar sands from Alberta, Canada. And it was a reroute because Native people, my nation, defeated the Keystone XL pipeline in our Republican controlled state governments. So think about this sort of contradiction that puts in, that puts in your mind when we're told by liberals are better for indigenous people, and the Republicans are going to be worse. The facts don't really play out in terms of how those policies are implemented, and how the indigenous-led movements against these extractive industries and to push for alternatives have played out on the ground.
It's interesting when you say there isn't a significant difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue, because a similar claim has been made by many people regarding Israel and Palestine. Is there a link between kind of how settler colonial projects like the United States or Canada or Australia or New Zealand operate in terms of the treatment of indigenous populations and those very same nations offering continuous support for Israel?
Earlier, you sort of gestured, or you sort of asked me to sort of pathologize the settler mindset or the colonizer mindset. And I try not to do that, but I'm going to do that in this case because I feel like there's an immense amount of violence that we're witnessing that's being live streamed in the palm of our hands on our smartphones. And there's a lot of disbelief. I think people who are sympathetic to a Palestinian and a free Palestine are sort of at a loss of like, how could this happen? And I would just say, look to the history of the United States. The United States has absorbed the genocide of indigenous people and the immense amount of violence that took to the point where most people don't even, we're speaking English for a reason. We're not speaking Lakota, we're not speaking the indigenous languages of this land. We're not following the indigenous laws of this land. And so when we think about how could we let something like the genocide in Palestine, unfold the way that it has, all we have to look back on is the treatment of indigenous people by the United States and the genocide that has been covered up and that is not acknowledged. That's one link. The other link is, just the fact that these are two settler colonial nations. They're both European projects. The Zionist project in Palestine, it started off with a British mandate, started off in a European country, much like the United States. And it implemented a sort of theft and taking of, the indigenous Palestinian land, the same way, in creating almost a parallel systems of reservations or Bantustans, as they call them in South Africa, or in the United States, the reservation systems that are sort of controlled. You can think of the Palestinian Authority as sort of a tribal government, where it has to be approved by the occupying power in what it does. So the parallels in that colonial situation are similar. I think the part of it that is more explicit in the context of Palestine is the genocidal nature of a settler colony. And it's exposing not just what Israel is and its fundamental nature. It's actually it's a mirror image of what the United States is and how it treats not only its indigenous people, but how it's genocided African people in a transatlantic slave trade, but also how it's waged imperial wars, for more than 2 centuries since its founding. It's been a state that is a nation state that was fundamentally founded as a capitalist, an imperialist, and expansionist nation state.
Nick Estes, thank you so much for joining me on Upfront.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, everybody, that is our show. Upfront, we'll be back next week.